Thank you, everybody, for tearing yourselves away from Twitter, BBC News, or whatever media outlet of choice to join us for today's lunchtime discussion on the Centre for Progressive Policy's new paper, Are We Ready? Navigating the Green Transition in an Age of Uncertainty. The Centre for Progressive Policy is a UK-wide economics think tank. We believe that equity and economic efficiency can and should go hand in hand. We reject the idea that prosperity or opportunity simply trickle down from successful places or people to the rest of us, and we think that contributing to economic life should bring dignity for all. Our economy, in turn, should help rather than hinder the flourishing of all people and places, and at CPP, we call this model inclusive growth. Our research is necessary but not sufficient for promoting inclusive growth. Through our Inclusive Growth Network, the IGN, we support places across the UK to deliver inclusive growth in practice and demonstrate how national policy can be informed by local approaches and interventions. Today, we're introducing the first paper in a series looking at the economic transitions coming our way over the course of the next decade. And I'm pleased to be joined by our senior research analyst, Ross Moody, who's been leading CPP's program into economic transitions and who wrote the paper that we're discussing today, and by Dr. Leanne Wilson, who manages the Energy Accelerator Programme at what is now the North East Combined Authority, and will be our discussant practitioner today. I'm Dan Turner, I'm the Head of Research and Analysis at CPP. Just in terms of logistics, I'm going to hand over to Ross to present his findings before Leanne and I join Ross for a brief conversation, and then we're going to hand over to you all for an audience Q&A session. If you have any questions, please just drop them into the Q&A function on Zoom as they occur to you. We'll be capturing all of those and we'll use them to structure our conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ross, who can talk you through his findings.
Thanks, Dan. And thank you also to everybody here that has joined us today. So yeah, for the next 10 minutes or so, I'll give a quick run through of our new report, which we published this morning, and sort of spotlight what we've looked at, why we've looked at it, and what we think it might tell us about the prospects for the green transition to create new economic opportunities across the country. So what we wanted to focus this report on is trying to put some numbers behind how ready we think different areas across the country might be to create green jobs in green industries. Lots of different factors might affect this, but one thing that we know already is that workers and the skills of the workforce of an area can either act as an enabler or a constraint to developing green industries locally. Now, this is relevant for two reasons. And, you know, we're in a period of particularly low unemployment at this moment in time, and that's one. And secondly, we already have a shortage of workers with the right skills to fill current green vacancies. So the effects that this has, will be to continue constraining different areas' ability to do two things. One is to develop distinct specialisms in green industries, including, new industrial clusters. And the second is to deliver sort of universal green service, if you like, particularly the metric retrofit. Because of this, we've sort of based the focus of this report on trying to wrestle with how we manage how we might navigate these two binding constraints. And on that basis, these are the two principles which have guided our analysis. One is that to tackle the green skills gap and facilitate the green transition, we'll need to be actively incentivise the reallocation of workers from non-green jobs and sectors into the green economy. And then secondly, the areas with more workers employed in jobs that share those similar skills to jobs in the green economy, they'll be sort of in a better position to capitalise on the economic opportunities of the green transition than other areas comparatively who don't have that and they might struggle. So we've sought to map the skills profiles of different parts of the country as part of this work and how they relate to green jobs as a proxy for how ready different areas are for the green transition. There's more information on this in the report, but essentially we've pulled together a bunch of data which reflects skills and work activities of different non-green and green jobs to calculate a measure of similarity between them. And then we've used that to determine how easy a worker might find it to transition into a green job. And then we've mapped that across workers at different geographical levels, so local authority, combined authority, and regional level. And what's important here is this on the right, and that's the type of green job. So just to explain, very quickly what the distinction between these two, and which is what we looked at. We've looked at green increased demand jobs, and just to sort of caveat, these are definitions taken from America, sort of internationally recognized definitions of different types of green jobs. But green increased demand jobs are jobs where the work activities don't necessarily change. We just need more of that person. So take a simple example, a bricklayer to build green infrastructure. Whatever they're building, they're going to be laying bricks, but we'll just need a lot more of that type of person for the green transition. And the second type of job is new and emerging. Now, these are sort of the more technical, sort of more pure green jobs, if you like, where they're a little bit more specialist. There's a lot of sort of engineering roles which are part of this in particular. But the premise is that the green economy and the activities of that will mean that new occupations will emerge, and we'll need more of that sort of person. And then our analysis, just very quickly, is focused on trying to understand three things, the distribution of potential workers across and between different parts of the country, differences between the type of area where people might live. So we focused in particular on areas based on the level of deprivation, productivity, but also area type as well. And then exploring where there might be areas where they're uniquely affected by what we call the relative pay effects, which is where basically a worker who's working in a non-green job potentially has good skills to transition to a green job, whether or not the wages that they might earn by transitioning may either be an incentive to switch or may be a barrier to switching into those jobs instead. So here's sort of, by pulling all that together, you sort of get these two maps, and on the left you can see is the sort of the green increased demand side of things, and on the right is the new and emerging. And I think the thing you can see, which is clear here, that the workers who can more easily transition into these types of jobs they're spread quite unevenly across the country. And of course, as you can see by looking at the two, that differs quite a lot depending on the type of green job. For increased demand jobs and workers, it's more the East Midlands, certain parts of Wales and the Southwest that we can see the real hotspots here. Whereas for new and emerging workers, it's sort of more the broad southeast and the east of England area, London in particular, where our analysis suggests that there's quite a lot of potential, a lot of workers there who have the more sort of relevant skill sets, working in non-green jobs, but to transition into jobs in the green economy. Interestingly as well, it seems that a lot of the areas that we identify with the most potential across both of these two types of green job, they tend to sit outside of England's combined authority structures, sort of as they are today. And in particular, many of the sort of leading combined authority areas, Greater Manchester, West Midlands, West and South Yorkshire, relative to other parts of the country, we sort of see that they tend to come out quite poorly. And often it's the case that it is some of the cities and the sort of larger areas within those boundaries which are sort of pulling them down a little bit when it comes to potential. Interestingly too, there's quite a split between the type of areas that workers we identify as having high green job potential live. So potential green increased demand workers that we identify disproportionately concentrated in former industrial heartlands and coastal areas at the top. But potential new and emerging workers, they tend to concentrate a bit more in sort of already wealthy areas with already sort of, high levels of productivity and a much stronger knowledge economy. And we can see actually, interestingly, but with this chart which is here, that, and this is just looking at potential new and emerging workers relative to deprivation, that there's sort of a negative trend, which demonstrates that point that I've just mentioned about some types of workers tending to live in sort of already wealthy areas. And when it comes to sort of other types of workers, another metric we looked at, we could not find any sort of link to substantiate the idea that workers who are living in areas that are higher in deprivation or lower in productivity are best equipped to move into green jobs. In a lot of cases, it tends to be quite the opposite. And that's one of the main findings, I think, of this report. Now, here's something that I find really quite interesting. So I mentioned earlier about the relative pay effect, and exploring whether the sort of workers, and depending on the job that they do and the wage that they earn doing that, may be incentivized or disincentivized to switch into green jobs. And these two maps here, which is firstly looking at the green increased demand category of job that we've been looking at, sort of show how that effects plays out. So in short, the potential effect of wages that people earn is that it makes the distribution of potential for different areas more uneven. That might help boost the prospects of some areas at the expense of others. So some areas we identify, Nottingham, Blackpool, Barking and Dagenham, Luton, just to name a few, they really sort of move up the rankings here due to this potential effect of wages. On the flip side, you have a lot of areas which are sort of already wealthy, particularly around the southeast of England, who are, by being already wealthy and by having workers who already do quite high productivity, high earning jobs, they may potentially be less incentivized to switch because they're already in a a position of, relative security. And that might have an effect on those areas and where they sit as well. For green, new and emerging jobs, just on this next map here, again, these are the more technical sort of pure green jobs, just a reminder, but here the effect is much greater, and in some sense it almost flips the geography of potential around completely, looking at the map on the left and then the map on the right. So particularly sort of really pushes down on the prospects of most of the southeast. If you focus on where London is and look at how sort of darker green it is on the left map and then how sort of pale white it is on the right hand side, that's the effect of sort of wages alone. And that, as we were saying, they're the ones where the content of local, they're the ones where the sort of context of that local labour market and the jobs that people are doing in the industries that are there might really matter when it comes for encouraging people to switch into green jobs. So what does it all mean for policy? So as we've mentioned at the start, this is a report which is sort of part of a much longer and a much broader series of research that we're doing. So we haven't recommended anything particular, but what we've taken away from this analysis of 5 individual things, I'll very quickly run through. But lesson 1 that we can see at the top is that there'll be no one size fits all for national policy when you're thinking about green labour market, transitions, green industrial strategy in particular. If a national policy is place blind for different types of green jobs, that may be to the benefit of some areas, but it may not necessarily be the most targeted and effective, and it may come at the detriment of others. Secondly, where the prospects for the green economy boosting productivity and good jobs in an area are potentially less promising, then industrial strategy should really actively focus on other areas, so other industries which are high productivity that those workers in those areas may be able to diversify into. Lesson number 3: green jobs, they won't automatically bring the biggest benefits to the poorest communities. If anything, our analysis suggests that in some cases it's the opposite. Sort of with no sufficient intervention based off of where we are today, pursuing the green transition in some cases will mean that those sort of benefits flow through to wealthier places. 4 of the 5 lessons: local wages matter. So this comes to the maps that I just showed. You can't understand the green transition necessarily without understanding competitor employers and local economies. And this is particularly true in a time of high employment. And lesson number 5, the last one, what we have seen, because of the fact that there's this uneven distribution of people across places, we have high levels of people employed. What in terms of policy that we might need to have a look at how we might incentivize people to move around the country, moving from one region into another, if what we really focus on is developing green industries and trying to fill vacancies as and when they emerge. And I'll stop there. I think that's everything, and I've had my 10 minutes and pass back over to Dan.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ross. I think there was so much in there. Those distinctions between everyday green jobs and the advanced emerging industrial jobs associated with the green economy, the distinction that you draw out between, I suppose I hadn't thought about it until I've just seen you present now, Ross, but really the differential opportunities in urban areas and urban economies versus the more rural areas and rural economies of England and Wales. And then that core message that there's no one-for-one relationship, therefore, between levelling up places with relative deprivation today and the opportunities that are posed by the green economy. So with those dimensions set out, I'm going to hand over to Leanne, who is actually on the ground trying to make a difference around all these sorts of issues within the Northeast. So Leanne, could you maybe share some of your reflections on what resonates from Ross's findings and the inquiry so far, and maybe a little bit more around the work that you're doing formerly with the North of Tyne, now with the Northeast, and how this feels from your perspective?
Thanks ever so much, Dan, and thanks, Ross, for running through this really interesting research. So for those of you who aren't aware of the North East Combined Authority, North of Tyne, the North East Combined Authority came into being on the 7th of May, so we've existed for basically a fortnight as an organisation. So during this webinar, I might be referring to work that's previously been undertaken through the North of Tyne Combined Authority, but it has relevance to the points that hopefully we'll get a chance to discuss. I think this research is really interesting. It highlights some significant challenges that we face across the country. And I think for me, it really highlights the need to concentrate effort in bridging those gaps as far as we're able to between the potential and actual opportunities associated with the green economy. I think Another reflection is that there are also place-based factors beyond the labour market that will serve to attract new industries. So, for example, land and power availability, proximity to supply chains. And I think another point that I'd be really interested to discuss is, we're talking about the labour market in general terms here, but lots of the sectors required for the green transition are the least diverse sectors in the economy. So, I think in order to make this green transition a just and inclusive transition, a lot of work is required in order to try and ensure that we can make this as inclusive as possible. So, Dan, I'm happy to provide some examples from the Northeast.
Yeah, and Leanne, could you tell us a little bit more as well on that point you just made around diversity? So you mean presumably within specific industries. Ross mentioned brickies earlier. I don't want to stereotype any particular job, but is that the sort of thing that you have in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a huge amount of statistics on this, but there is an energy and utility skills partnership, and their workforce renewal strategy recognises a huge lack of diversity in the energy and utilities workforce. I think it's reasonably correct to say that this is also reflected across other sectors, for example, construction, land-based industries, engineering consultancies, although less so in the consultancy sector. The EU Skills Partnership Strategy points to the fact that in key sectors like power, gas, waste and water, essentially white men represent over 70% of the workforce. I'm sure that more detailed demographic statistics are collected more generally across the new and emerging green sectors, although I don't see this reported. There have been some really great initiatives. It's recognised as a huge challenge, but there's a lot more that we need to do. I mean, in terms of the Northeast, there are some great local initiatives, including things like employability programs being delivered by Women into Construction. In our commissioning for the adult education budget for engineering, skills providers were specifically asked how they'll engage with underrepresented groups. And in terms of the commissioning for skills funding funded through the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, the specification for that work explicitly asked what engagement activities would be undertaken to raise awareness of opportunities in the green sector, including to residents that might not already be aware or engaged. But I think there are some structural issues in terms of diversity and inclusion that we really need to treat as central and fundamental to the green transition, so that we can benefit from the wider skills and talents that are within our local communities already.
So I suppose that question of the demographic representativeness of the workforce is one of the challenges that you're confronting in the Northeast. There'll be a wider set of challenges around your current industrial structure, around perhaps industrial plants that at the moment are very carbon intensive, that need to oversee a transition, people who maybe work in an adjacent job or sector who will need to retrain to move into, to take advantage of some of these opportunities. Could you tell us a little bit more about practically what it looks like on the ground in the Northeast for trying to design programs to support those people and to realise the opportunity?
Thanks, Dan. So as a point of clarification, the diversity and inclusion issue is certainly not specific to the Northeast. It is a general issue across sectors generally, both nationally and globally. In terms of the work we're doing and have been doing as a mayoral combined authority, there are a number of elements of activity. So we fund sector development, we fund infrastructure, we fund, opportunities to develop supply chains and create economic opportunities associated with these green sectors, in addition to the work that we do on skills. I guess in terms of the Northeast sort of general strengths. We do have a huge amount of skills from manufacturing, maritime, oil and gas sectors that are relevant to transition into a green economy. We are a major hub for offshore energy and subsea. We've got significant manufacturing strengths in electric vehicles and emerging strengths in developing heat networks, where we've got a huge pipeline of projects. Home retrofits are a major opportunity as well as a challenge in the Northeast, as with other areas across the north of the country. But we do have significant opportunities. We've got large numbers of people already employed in manufacturing sectors and digital sectors, and high proportions of students already studying STEM and digital skills. So it's not all a terrible story. I think some of the work that we've done in terms of bridging the gap between potential new opportunities and future employer demands are quite interesting, actually. So we have previously funded work with skills providers and employers to better understand how we can do this. So there was one project called the Green Growth Foresighting Project, which was both research and engagement. So there was a really extensive desk review done of, I think it was over 90 studies around green jobs, to really understand what evidence exists on green skills requirements and opportunities in key sectors. So this work for us focused on offshore wind, electrical vehicles and batteries, and green construction in its broad terms. So that would also include solar PV and low carbon heating. So the objectives of this were to understand the skills gaps that are currently apparent, recruitment difficulties and barriers to training, and then the research team engaged with key employers in these sectors to understand, in a very direct way, what their training requirements were, what potential solutions might exist to the skills gap that have been identified. So this was a really, really interesting bit of work, and the skills needs and training needs of employers were then taken and turned into career advice, which has been provided in schools. And this work's also informed the commissioning of some of our adult skills provision, for example, through skills boot camps. So the kind of green skills that have been supported through those boot camps include offshore wind, EV and batteries, green construction, and then also natural resource management, for example, forestry. So what we found with this piece of work and in other studies that have been done regionally is that, there are significant advantages in terms of average wages and productivity associated with green jobs in the sense we're talking about today. But employers aren't just looking for the higher level engineering jobs. There are combinations of apprenticeships, graduate roles and experienced roles that are required. So some large employers also see entry-level manufacturing apprenticeships as a way of attracting and retaining staff. So I completely agree that there are huge policy uncertainties and a huge range of challenges, but I think that, the work that we've done and we can see in other places too really does demonstrate how regional collaboration can help in starting to understand, unpick and address some of these challenges. I think, the findings of the research that you've undertaken, I agree with. It's not going to happen in a vacuum and it's not going to happen without concerted effort, but I don't think it's a sort of bleak outlook by any stretch of the imagination.
Real, thank you, Leanne. I'm going to use chair's privilege to offer, I suppose I'm going to say more of a comment than a question for myself, and offer just 3 reflections on the trade-offs that we're talking about, I think, implicitly in what you've been describing, Ross, and how it feels then when you try to implement this on the ground, as you've been doing, Leanne, up in the Northeast. So I think three trade-offs that we've already started discussing. One that's fundamental to your paper, Ross, is around green jobs, the carbon transition, and trying to link that into the levelling up agenda and the risk that there might be a trade-off between levelling up and green growth. So you can understand why you would try to link those two concepts. There's a very good political reason why, because a lot of the places that I think practitioners have in mind when they talk about the link between levelling up and green growth are political swing states, places that might be relatively skeptical around economic transitions, the experience of economic change, for very good reason, given their experience of economic change over the past few decades. And I think economically, there are good reasons why you would try and link the two as well, right? So a lot of the communities that we're talking about have a relatively high level of skills, as you've described, Leanne, in energy, in advanced manufacturing, in exactly the sorts of sectors that we imagine would most naturally translate into the green industries that we want to try and build for the future. But I don't think we should be surprised by Ross's finding that it's not always going to be as straightforward as that in practice, and that the green transition will really vary place by place, and what those pathways look like will vary place by place. Because if your local economy is in general less skilled, less resilient, has struggled with the economic transitions of the past few decades, we should place quite a high standard of evidence that it's going to be significantly easier for them to transition in the next generation or over the next decade. And so if there is a trade-off between levelling up and green growth, I think the question then goes to national policymakers, and after the next election, when I'm sure whoever wins, the government will set out some form of industrial strategy and they will talk about green jobs. How spatially blended do they want them to be? Or do they want to go for the path of least resistance, which might put a lot of these manufacturing jobs into that M5 corridor between London and Bristol? So then related to that, I think there's a second trade-off between green jobs and any other jobs. So all of the effort that you have to put into the programming to design skills programs, to provide direct support for people, as you've described, Leanne, create or will help direct people, businesses, capital into green sectors as opposed to other sectors. And now you could reasonably say the climate transition is an existential challenge and everyone needs to play their part. And we're in a world of an end or a stagnation or a reversal of globalization, the need to reshore economic activity and supply chains or friendshore them, all of which I think is valid. But I think what we need to ask ourselves is, not least given Ross's finding that some of these local economies will struggle more than others to adapt to the green economy, would we be better focusing our efforts on encouraging growth in other sectors, so digital jobs, green consultancy maybe, rather than industrial aspects of green work, or encouraging people into other types of economic activity that helps the UK or the Northeast or whichever unit we want to talk about to pay its way, and then to buy wind turbines from Denmark, as we have been doing for the past 15 years, rather than building them ourselves. So that trade-off between, if we are going to grow, do we go into green industries or do we go into other industries where potentially we have more comparative advantages, I think we should take seriously. And then finally, I think there's a trade-off between green growth and the pace at which we want to decarbonize. So the easiest path, I think, at the moment to just rapidly decarbonizing our energy system would be to buy as much stuff off the shelf as possible from global markets, as opposed to taking resource and trying to use it to build new economic clusters, new types of economic activity within the UK. It may be that that's too simple a way of putting it, and I'm sure that there will be people who have a counter view to that. But I'm sure at the margin there will be a choice between, do we want to invest in our own green industries, where we may already be several decades behind competitors in the global market, or do we want to lean into other economic strengths and buying green technologies from global markets to begin with? All of which I think is to say that we're entering a stage in the discussion around green technologies and green growth in the UK that I think is just much more mature and is starting to grapple with those trade-offs more seriously. There's, looking back over the past 10 years, we've gone from UK leadership in a statement of intent around net zero, lots of activity in the Northeast, elsewhere, other partners across the country and the nations, to say, what would a green transition look like in our place? And now we're starting to really hit some of the constraints and harder choices. And I would suggest that that's an area, looking into the general election, into the next parliament, the next government, that we could really do with clarity on of how do we trade off across those different sources. Okay, that'll be my only substantial contribution in my role as chair. But I'm going to pass back to Ross and then bring in Leanne for any other reflections before we go into audience Q&A.
Thank you, Dan. I think I'm slightly mindful of time, and I'm seeing there's a lot of brilliant questions which are coming in through. So I won't sort of speak too much on what's been said, other than to say that I agree that it's sort of, I think that there is some sort of broad political economic consensus that the green transition is a good thing and that we should be doing it. I think that the argument that there is a trade-off, I think, is well understood between, like you're saying, how much you want to pursue the sort of development of your own domestic green industries rather than sort of insourcing or sort of, you know, being connected through global markets and that bit. I think it is that side of it, I feel, is sort of increasingly being understood, but also increasingly difficult to actually navigate. I mean, if you look around the rest of the world, I mean, Biden and sort of what's happening in America with the Inflation Reduction Act, everything that's going on with the European Union and some very sort of similar interventions that they've been making recently. And then if you look at some of the interventions being proposed in this country, particularly if you look at Labour and the Green Prosperity Plan, there is almost like a green arms race, if you like. And I think that on one side of it, that is a sort of a larger expansion of global markets in general. And that might make things more cost effective and easier when you think about regional development and bringing things in. But there is still a trade-off to be made, I think, between how much you want to sort of support the development of domestic green industries as distinct from that. And my sense is that, politically speaking, and even potentially economically speaking as well, the latter of that, to sort of support domestic green industries, is probably the route that we're going to end up going down. And then that sort of brings back up a lot of the other trade-offs that you sort of mentioned as well. Partly some of the stuff that, you know, our research we published this morning is sort of highlighting, and that if we're going to go through that sort of path of reindustrialization and a focus on domestic green growth and having that being something of a leveling up story, then there are constraints when it comes to the labour market, but then there are also sort of constraints as well when you think about, as been mentioned, different tiers of governance and how you might sort of implement industrial strategy, the sort of time horizon that you might be looking towards, and where you want to make successes, thinking particularly about decarbonisation and carbon budgets, etc. So in short, I think there's a lot which is quite difficult and unfortunately timely, because there's a general election obviously on the horizon, that whoever will win that was going to have to make some quite substantial choices quite quickly. And I think on some of those nuances, I don't think we're quite there yet. Leanne,
anything you want to add?
Yeah, thanks ever so much, Dan and Ross. I mean, just some reflections back. You know, foundational skills are foundational skills. They can be developed into whichever industry you choose to go to. So it's a very, very low risk strategy to improve our foundational skills and improve people's life chances, right? That's low risk. I don't believe there is as much of a trade-off between some of those sectors as may have been presented either. I mean, digital skills are going to be absolutely crucial for a decarbonised, smart economy. I think as well, there are advantages in domestic manufacturing in some cases. You know, sometimes there are issues with supply chains. The shipment of massive goods and products all over the globe has its own carbon footprint too. There is real opportunities also around circular manufacturing and repurposing and repowering. So I think that it's really hard to give in a general sense a real response to some of the things you're talking about, because I think in reality it's often more nuanced than that. I do think that we have an urgent need to decarbonise our infrastructure, and we would be remiss if we weren't seeking to capitalise on all of the opportunities that will provide immediately within the medium and longer term for our communities.
Great. I'm conscious that the session was due to finish at 22, but if it's okay with people, if we maybe just run that over another 5 minutes till 1:45, so we have time for questions from the audience. Please do keep them coming in. We're getting great questions sent through. I will bundle a couple up for you first, Leanne, if that's okay. So first question from Tom is around how we ensure that employers are playing their part So whether they're directly or indirectly affected by decarbonisation, what's the role of employers and how do we get them on board with a just transition? And then we've had another question which references a previous seminar where a civil servant union representative said that they thought there was a case for a national transition service. What do you think to that specific proposal, and whether that's defined in terms of more of a national role for overseeing transition, or maybe more broadly, what's the role for national government in supporting place-based decarbonisation efforts?
Thanks, Dan. So I think firstly, in sort of regional economies and local economies, skills providers already do engage very strongly with employers. So there are already mechanisms by which employers' needs are communicated and adjusted to, and green skills and inclusive green opportunities can be communicated and promoted. So, our local examples of that could include the Women into Construction, where we had a number of key employers who were actively engaging with employability programs and have provided great opportunities, work experience and jobs for women who've been participated in those programs. In terms of the National Transition Service, I'm not familiar with the detail of that proposal, so I'm probably not going to be able to substantively comment. Oh, sorry, there's lots of questions coming through. More support for transition and economic benefit is something that I believe would be a very positive thing. Ross, I don't know if that's something you'd like to come in on.
Yeah, just very, very quick on the National Transition Service. So a couple of years ago, when Theresa May was still in power, all those years ago, there was an idea being introduced about a national retraining scheme, which I sort of came across while doing research for this, and the fundamentals of it seem absolutely sound. They seem like fundamentally quite a good idea, and if anything, it is putting some emphasis on the idea that we will need to think more seriously about retraining people for transitions which are coming our way. So that was a policy that was introduced. It was never properly operationalised, and it seems to have died a death. So I would suggest to anyone who might win a general election that somewhere on the hard drives of the civil service there's a lot of detail for a scheme and a policy which is already there, which I'm sure would be of benefit to a lot of people.
Great. Ross, there was a specific question, I think, for you around green enhanced skills jobs roles. Do you want to cover that?
Yeah, so no, that's a good question that someone asked. So it's more of a clarification point, I suppose, but the definitions that we've used for the two green jobs, there is also a third, which is called green enhanced skills, and we've exempted them from this analysis, and the sort of thinking behind that is, so far as I remember the definition of that job, that it's not so much that people are necessarily trained, that sort of changing jobs or anything like that. The idea behind that is they're jobs where people will continue to do the same thing, but greening of the economy, decarbonisation would mean that they would have to do slightly different tasks as part of that. And I can't remember a specific example, unfortunately, but it was exempted because of the fact that it's not necessarily jobs that will need more people of to facilitate and to deliver something. It's more the effects that the green economy may have on individual tasks that people who would stay within those jobs already do. So that's the reason that was exempted. But thank you for picking that up, whoever did, because it is a fair point.
And then we have two related questions that are around the politics of the green transition, I suppose is the best way to put it. So maybe if I suggest, I'll come to you first, Ross, then you, Leanne, for your views on these two questions. The first is, do we think that the major political parties are giving green transition related issues sufficient attention? And if so, or if not, how do we think that implementation of the proposals that you've set out, Ross, or the work that you're doing, Leanne, can be supported through national politics? And then relatedly, given that sense that the national political conversation has slightly shifted away from some hard choices on decarbonisation or pushing transition, what could voters or other interested parties do to try to demand more radical, more assertive action on green transition policies from our politicians?
Yeah, so I'll take the first question, but I think the two main political parties are given, in terms of giving the issue attention. I think there has been quite a lot. So if you go back to a few years ago, there was Boris Johnson and there was the sort of 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution that was, quite ambitious in its intention. Followed on by that was the levelling up agenda, which we talked about a lot because there was an easy sort of link between green growth and levelling up and there being a potential opportunity there. That's on the Conservative side. I think probably at the top of the party that's fizzled out a little bit, but there is still a wing there which is really pushing for it, onward. Think Tank have sort of published some work recently. They're doing this sort of program of work on the future of conservatism, which has made a case for, green industries, advanced manufacturing, and really pushing for that. So it exists on that side. I think the Labour Party is a bit more obvious. They've spoken about the Green Prosperity Plan being a big sort of feature of their industrial strategy. And I think that will stick, although, the Green Prosperity Plan, the sort of pound value that attached to that has been scaled down. It does seem to be something that they're quite keen to stick with. I think the one thing that is missing sort of on both sides is sort of what we're suggesting, some of what our research published this morning is implying it's that human capital sort of element. So there's a case being made broadly for physical capital. There's a lot of arguments being sort of put forward which are completely valid around planning reform and some of the constraints of the planning system and what we could do to liberalise that to allow infrastructure to develop. But there are issues which are known and which are known sort of nationally when it comes to the green skills, and that sort of being a deficit in terms of human capital, and there's less of much of a discussion about that and what we might do to deal with it. And then when it comes to a more local sort of regional level, when it comes to regional rebalancing, it is, there are opportunities here. How you sort of operationalize some of those sort of skills, human capital development schemes, whatever they may be, to plug some of those gaps. Again, it's another thing that we know from, a lot of the things that Leanne has mentioned already. Local combined authorities are sort of doing a lot of this stuff. I think there's a lot of examples that we've spoken about where national government can learn. And then I suppose really the focus would be on, well, can you take a look at what areas are already doing and what can we sort of decisively want to scale up, and what would some of the funding and what would some of the money look like to actually do that? Because all the ambitions that you might have on physical infrastructure, ultimately that will be constrained if you don't have physical sort of manpower, people to actually deliver it. So it's another side of the same equation, but I think it's one that's been overlooked quite a lot. And I think there is still more to be done on sort of selling that argument in politically, but also in policy terms as well.
Leanne?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'm a politically restricted officer, so I'm not going to make any comments on policy priorities at this point in time. I think the key things that we've learned from decades of activity from all flavors of government is that poorly managed transitions impact people, jobs, supply chain, investor confidence, and outcomes. So there's a huge amount of work done. Sometimes I think there's a risk of making the perfect the enemy of the good. Most policies are not going to be perfect when they're brought in. It doesn't mean we have to rip them up and start again from scratch. If we look, across the world, there are numbers of policies which may not be directly applicable to us, but have proven successful and could be modified and amended for a UK context. And likewise, we can share some examples of where we've done some really, really good work that would be relevant for other countries. So I would just say that, well-managed transitions are important. I've worked on climate change for over 20 years. I'm never going to think any political party gives it enough attention. But I think the reality is there are so many win-win opportunities for the green economy to have positive impacts in other sectors that we don't necessarily need to be looking at this in isolation anymore. It is part of the wider story and our general economy. It's not something that's exceptional.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Leanne. Thank you, Ross, for your presentation today and for your wider research. Please go read the full publication on our website, and we're keen to keep the conversation going. So tweet us at Centre Pro Policy, email any of us, reach out through social media, or if we see you in person over the next few weeks, we're keen to keep going to discuss how we can support transitions in the UK. This is the first of a series of papers, exact number TBC, that Ross is working on. So we're going to be having similar conversations around other sectors, other sectoral challenges and place-based challenges before we get into really some of the ribs around the policy choices that we'd like to see made in the next Parliament. thank you for sharing your lunchtime with us. Hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.